Hello and welcome to the show. This is Martin Willis, and a lot of what I do is dovetailed in the antiques and arts world, is dovetailed with history. And so every once in a while, I like to do a podcast on history. I've interviewed a number of people on different topics, like Thomas Jefferson Scholar and people like that. If you look on the Antique Auction Forum, you'll see all those type of podcasts back then. Just a couple of things when I started this podcast. I had Phyllis Gow with me. I was basically mentoring her, and she was a lot of people really liked her. She's very bubbly, very full of life, and she's had quite a career path. I'm just bringing this up because I want to talk about uh, this is her now, and she's an auctioneer at Sotheby's now. When we were working together, I told her a bit how to auction, but she just had a natural way with it. She's very good. So here she is at Sotheby's, and she's being really celebrated now, which is really nice. She just sold the world's most expensive dinosaur for 44.6 million. So I'm so glad for Phyllis. I've really been very happy about her career path. It's had a couple of bumps along the way, but she's got a great attitude, and I think this is a real good proof that she's come out on top. Definitely. So my guest is Jake Sconyers, and I'm really excited to talk about him. He has Hub History. It's a podcast that talks about Boston. I was born in Boston. I've always had a connection there. I love the town. It's very interesting, and I know a lot of people there, and it's a really friendly, historic, wonderful town. And Jake, I want to welcome you to the show.
Hey, I appreciate you having me on.
And you used to be a tour guide in Boston, so that's you really got to know what's going on if you're a tour guide. What came first? Did you have the history? You want to learn the history first, and then became a tour guide? Is that what it was?
Well, I'm a transplant to Boston, so I've lived in Boston since the late '90s, and I feel like because I didn't grow up here, I didn't get bored with all the places they made you go on a field trip in 5th grade, the way a lot of my peers now who live here have been. So I still, I moved here as a young adult, and I had that sense of wonder and that sense of curiosity about Boston. Boston's a terrific city. I love this city. Again, I've been here for over 25 years now. And so I was always a little bit of a history nerd growing up. My family, we wouldn't go to Disneyland for vacation. We'd go to Gettysburg, so it was, I always had that history bug, even as a young kid. And then getting here and exploring, I really like to soak up a lot of the history. Boston obviously has a rich, nearly now 400-year history. But then the sharing that with people came a little bit later, starting around 2012 or so. My wife and I started a tour company where we created and led, I think, 4 or 5 different tours in different neighborhoods and focuses. And so that let me sort of share that excitement, that joy, that love of Boston and its history with people. Yep. But it took up all our time and didn't really, we broke even barely in the end. So
that's too bad. Yeah.
After a couple of years, we got out of that. Went off. I was a docent, a volunteer docent at a local historic site for a summer. And then while I was a docent there, I had the bright idea. My wife and I were both docents there. We were sort of trying to one up each other with stories, who had the weirdest, most interesting, whatever stories from Boston history, back and forth across the sort of docent bullpen, waiting for the next guests to come in. And that's where the idea for a podcast was born. So we were trading all these cool stories back and forth, and we said, we should write some of these down. What should we do with this? Oh, let's start a podcast. So we started the Hub History podcast in 2016. We're at I'm just working on episode 310 at the moment. So a lot of stories have been told. There's still lots of stories to tell. I'm still just as excited about Boston history as I ever was.
Yeah. It's funny. I have looked for like weird history, what are some weird things that have happened in Boston, other than this. And so I'd like to, maybe touch a little bit on that after. But first of all, let's dive right in and talk about this very unusual. It sounds, like before we went live here, you mentioned that it's kind of a joke to some people, but this was a serious thing. And, people were killed. And who could ever, when I first heard the Boston Molasses Flood, I'm thinking, what? And how could that be even dangerous. But when you
Right.
have 2 million gallons, over 2 million gallons, and all of a sudden a tank bursts, and you're talking 35 miles an hour molasses, everyone thinks of molasses as really slow.
Right. I mean, it's an aphorism in the English language,
Yeah,
right? Somebody's moving
yeah,
slower than molasses in January, and this is a molasses flood in January in
yeah.
Boston. So it seems like, again, when I was a tour guide, a lot of visitors in Boston have heard about the molasses flood. They want to know more about it. We used to have a North End tour, and people would ask about it with that idea of it being sort of a punchline, something funny that happened. And some of the travel sites and sometimes kids sites sort of reinforce that humorous aspect, but it was a terrible tragedy. I mean, we had over 20 people killed, at least 150 injured, some of them grievously injured, huge amounts of property damage. From the elevated train tracks to just buildings scoured off the face of the earth. It was really a terrible tragedy that's only funny because it's been over a century.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, so let's talk about well how it happened. And generally speaking, I hate to say it, but it always trickles back to money. And
Yeah.
uh that's what it was really all about, saving money and making money and profits and all
And
that.
molasses from the very earliest days of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, molasses and the products you can make from molasses were integral to the Boston economy for basically 300 years, from very early in the English settlement of the Shawmut Peninsula, right up through the Prohibition era. Molasses was right at the heart of Boston's economy. And that's because of originally, again, sort of, if you go back far enough, it's because of the triangle trade. We have manufactured goods being shipped out of Europe, out of England, traded in Africa for people, for enslaved people. They're shipped to the Americas, North and South, and then they basically produce agricultural products, the most important of which for centuries was sugar.
Mm,
And then sugar, the most stable way to ship sugar around is as molasses. It's non-perishable at room temperature, so it's easy to put it in a cask, put it on a ship, and move it around the world. Here in Boston, we wanted a way into the triangle trade. We don't have, some of the southern colonies could produce these vast crops of rice and things like that could be food staples for those sugar islands in the Caribbean where so much of the sugar is produced. Boston, I don't know, and you're, I think, New Hampshire based. Same thing up there, the Granite State. We grow a lot more stones than we do wheat around here. So for
yeah.
us, our entries into the triangle trade were salted cod. Salt cod could be shipped. Again, it was stable at room temperature. It could be shipped to the Caribbean. It was used to feed both the enslavers and the enslaved who worked there. And then our other big entry into the triangle trade was rum, because the molasses, again, sort of stable form of sugar, could be shipped from the Caribbean to New England, and then we could then further distill and refine it here into rum. There was then sort of a globally sought after commodity. It could be shipped back to Europe, and a lot of it then was shipped to Africa and used as currency to enslave more people, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, but I went and dusted off some of my old notes about rum in Boston just to get some stats. So by 1717, Boston was manufacturing 200,000 gallons of rum every year. So that's very
Mm,
early on. And by 1750, there were 63 active distilleries in Boston making upwards of 700,000 gallons of rum yearly. So this is
wow.
a very important economic output for the city and for the region. There's a consolidation process. So by the time the turn of the 20th century, as we get a little closer to the incident we're talking about happens, uh, distilling is consolidated. There are really a handful of larger distilleries, Boston, Cambridge, a few outlying towns, but it's still very important into the 20th century. Um, and the molasses disaster happens in January 1919, just as we're coming out of the First World War.
Yeah, can we
And
just, back
yeah,
up just a
sorry.
little bit because
Yeah,
I
yeah,
like where you were going when you first talked about that, but I wanna go back to 1770 when you're talking
yeah.
about that, because and then we'll go right back to 1919 when this happened. But, s I, I did an auction. It was actually the sign of the Declaration. I went through all his ledgers. It was really a fascinating auction. That was back in 1989. But I read so many times, I'd read either keg or cask, I can't remember the term, but of rum and molasses, like over and over again. You'd see the purchase of it. And you got to realize that back then in the 18th century, people were drinking all the time. They were drinking alcohol all the time in the morning while they were working in the fields. They didn't trust drinking water. And this is just another little tidbit. I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but if they drank water, if they drank it out of a silver cup, a real silver cup, it was much healthier. And because it killed a lot of things, the silver would kill a lot of things that were in the water. But people got really sick by drinking water, and then they drank alcohol and distilled, alcohol instead.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and look at the maps from 17th, 18th, well into the 19th century, basically up through the cholera epidemic of, I think, the 1850s in Boston, privies and wells were right next to each other all the time.
That's right.
So drinking water was not to be trusted. People didn't even refer. I do a lot of reading in the Adams papers, John Adams diaries and letters, and
wow,
he writes about cider and porter and beer, but at the time, cider and beer weren't even really considered alcohol. It was just what you drank when you weren't trying to get tipsy from the rum or whiskey.
Yeah, crazy. So I just wanted to touch on that because I was always surprised at how much people drank back then. Then there was the temperance movement that came along, 1840s, I think it was, or something like that. But I mean, still, it was there was a lot of drinking, and a lot of it had to do with people worried about drinking water. I don't think that's really much of a known fact. But so we get into the 1919, and I'm trying to remember the year Prohibition was 1920. I can't even remember. Close to it. Yeah.
That is a great fact. So if you look at the news coverage from the day after the molasses disaster, which was I believe the collapse happened on January 15th. And so the morning papers the next day are really how people are finding out about the molasses flood. The Boston Globe, the Boston Post, all the Boston papers above the fold like this carry the molasses tank explosion, the disaster, overestimate in the coming days, the death toll is going to be overestimated, then come back down to reality. But below the fold in all these papers, the other front page news is the race to be the 36th state to ratify the Prohibition Amendment. So actually the day after the molasses disaster, Nebraska becomes that 36th state. So the law goes into effect 1 year later in 1920, like you said, but sharing the front page with the molasses disaster is news about Prohibition. And then the other story that a lot of the papers carry is sort of fears about a new outbreak of war because there's so much just chaos and disorder in post-war Europe. So
there's the anarchy movement too. And when it comes to the use of this molasses, wasn't a lot of it had to do something with wartime? And
so that's why it's so appropriate for the Prohibition and fears of a new outbreak of war to be sharing the front pages, because U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, which is the sort of umbrella corporation that owns the molasses tank that we're talking about, the main use wasn't really rum at that point. The main use for the molasses they were importing into Boston is in munitions. So it's used as basically they're refining ethanol. So it's used as a solvent, and it's used in manufacturing a lot of different explosives. I saw an estimate that a 16-inch naval gun, so this is these huge naval cannons in the World War I, sort of the peak of the battleship era. They mount these enormous naval guns that fire a shell that's hundreds of pounds of explosives. But each one of those, the powder that fires each round, I saw between what was actually in the powder and in the manufacturing process would be something like 60 gallons of alcohol to fire every round from a 16-inch naval gun.
Wow. Huh. Interesting.
So it's a very valuable commodity still in the 20th century, but for different reasons now because it's such a important industrial component.
So this, first of all, let's talk about the location of and why did they pick the North End? The North End now you think of great Italian food. It's the
Yeah.
Italian end of Boston, and but why would they? Do you know? Is it because of was it a close proximity to the harbor where they could get, the shipments to it, or what was the reason they picked this area?
Yeah, so the tank that I love this photo of the tank you have pulled up. It gives a great sense of the scale of it. So it's about 50 feet tall, about 90 feet in diameter, and it's right on the waterfront. So if you were to look through those buildings and through that tank, you'd probably see the harbor right behind. I always think of but before all the land making that went on in the late 19th century, early 20th century to sort of expand Boston. If you look at an old map of Boston, the Shawmut Peninsula, where Boston's situated, looks kind of like a mitten. And the north end is the thumb on the mitten. So it's surrounded by water on three sides and wharves all around those three sides. The wharves are still there. They're just more likely to have condos than sort of these big transshipment points now. But U.S. Industrial Alcohol builds that tank in 1915, basically in the ramp up to wartime. It's very hastily built, which we can talk about, but it's located such that it's used for basically transshipping. So molasses comes in on these giant tanker ships from the Caribbean. The first load was, I think, December 31st, 1915. So they just got it completed in time to take the 700,000 gallons of Cuban molasses that were incoming. And then it's used they can then put it into there's some pipelines for local distilleries. They also offload it into train cars, tanker cars on trains from there, because there were train spurs coming right up to the wharves in most cases. So they're not really distilling at that location in the North End, but they're shipping it out. They're bringing it in on these giant cargo ships and then moving it out on train cars and pipelines.
And speaking of that, this is right by, you mentioned the train trestle. And was there an active train actually?
Yeah.
Wasn't there like almost an issue, almost a train mishap too?
There was a trolley was affected. I get the impression that it was sort of tilted but not derailed or something like that. But I think that was a surface trolley. So you had several different. When you think about the railways, we had the elevated railway that's pictured here that's carrying basically it's passenger travel, but it's up off of the street level. It's using steam locomotives. And then on a lot of the surface streets, you'd have streetcars, which were electrified by that point, much smaller sort of local connections. And then there were freight railroads coming into the wharves also. So so sort of the height of steam and rail travel. So you had all these different transportation modes coming into the North End between the harbor, the railways, the streetcars. So the tank, again, it sort of looms over this area. The elevated train tracks run right down Commercial Street, which is sort of bounding around the perimeter of the North End. And the center of the North End is sort of a hill. It's a glacial deposit of sand, sort of a sandy hill called Copp's Hill, where a famous burying ground, lots of patriots. The Mather family is buried there. Lots of great tombs to go see there. But right at the foot of Copp's Hill is Commercial Street. And Commercial Street and those elevated train tracks sort of form the boundary between the industrial North End and the waterfront, and then the more residential North End uphill from the train tracks. But they do intermingle.
Where the Cotton Mather family was, is that anywhere near the Revere homestead or whatever Revere home?
Yes,
in the same area.
It's just a few blocks away. It's not even probably a 6-minute walk from the Revere house, which actually is the same site as the Mather house, which is a fun little factoid. Not the same structure, but the same site where Cotton Mather had his home, facing across North Square to the what at the time was the North Meeting House, which was Cotton Mather's church, the Congregational Church, Puritan church. And then just a few blocks away was the Anglican church where Paul Revere worshipped and as a teenager was a bell ringer.
How about that?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's pretty cool.
yeah. So, and I was there. You probably were there too when they opened the time capsule. Were you there?
No, I
Uh,
watched eagerly on TV, but I wasn't actually there
yeah.
for it.
Yeah, I was there. That was fun. So let's talk about first of all, what was the purpose of them building that tank, and talk about how they just raced to get that thing done, and they didn't do all the things they were supposed to do. There's definitely negligence there.
Yeah, again, it was very rushed. There was the again, this industrial alcohol company is seeing the writing on the wall that war is coming to Europe, so they're anticipating an increased demand for this sort of refined ethanol they create out of the molasses that's being shipped into Boston. And then they put you would think they would put who? A structural engineer, an architect, construction manager, a somebody experienced in building things in charge of this project. But
Mhm.
instead, the company treasurer is put in charge of overseeing the construction of this giant uh, molasses tank capable of holding almost 3 million gallons of molasses. And he cuts basically every corner. He first of all, he doesn't understand. He has no conception of sort of the different grades of steel and the uses of different grades of steel and the difference between structural steel. And so he's just basically, again, he's the treasurer. He's using the cheapest components, the cheapest materials available. They rush through construction. There's no margin of error built in the many lawsuits that result out of this terrible disaster. Um, the plaintiffs, the families of the victims, hire an MIT engineering professor to sort of do their investigation, and he finds that the grade of steel that was used in the tank could handle something like 16,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, but the full tank would have exerted something like 41,000 pounds
Oh,
of pressure.
gee,
And it was customary to build in a margin of error of 3 or 4 times the expected load. So
sure.
not only yeah, they would have expected to build a tank like that with the capacity of retaining multiple times the expected maximum load, and instead they built it with steel that was a fraction of the strength that was needed. They never test it. They never fill it with water or anything before the first shipment arrives.
And they were supposed to, or they claim they did, right? They were supposed to test it.
It was at least customary. So what another
Yeah.
thing that comes out of this whole case is at the time there were some standards in place. The Boston Building Department had published standards that you had to meet for uh, certain commercial buildings, for bridges, but there was no published standard for tanks like that, for an industrial tank. So they were just
Mm.
left to their own devices to build whatever they thought suitable. And again, because of this sort of mixed nature of the development in the North End along Commercial Street, along the elevated tracks, it's a mix of wharves, heavy industrial sites, but then there are people's homes mixed in throughout, and it's mostly uh, an immigrant community at the time. The early 20th century, it was just becoming sort of the little Italy of Boston that it is today. It's been through this whole series of waves of immigration. Now, obviously, starting with the Puritan migration in the 1600s, and then the next big wave is the Irish immigration following the potato famine in the
Mhm.
1840s.
Mhm.
And there's in the late 19th century, there's a wave of mostly Eastern European and Russian Jewish immigrants. And then right at the turn of the 20th century is when the big wave of Italian immigration starts. So it's been a gateway community for hundreds of years, and it was certainly at the turn of the 20th century. I think if you would walk through the streets of the North End at the time, you would have heard a half dozen languages being spoken,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
smelled all different cuisines cooking in every direction. So it would have been a really sort of culturally rich neighborhood, but an
Yeah.
economically very not rich neighborhood at the time.
Yeah. There was a lot of poverty at yeah, from what I understand then. Yeah, certainly. So they build this, uh, it's unbelievable. And, uh, the one
From the
thing I never knew,
moment
how
it's
many
completed,
years
yeah.
what's that?
So I say I was going to say from the moment the tank is completed, people are complaining. Um,
Okay.
they
What are
say
they?
the
Yeah.
first time it's filled, it starts creaking and
Oh,
moaning, and so neighbors immediately complain to the company. They say this thing's going to collapse. Um, at least one company employee did sort of what we call a whistleblower today. Went to the executives and said, "This thing ain't right. It's not constructed well," and it was very visibly leaking all over. Years ago, probably 5 years or more ago, I did an episode for my podcast, the Hub History podcast, about the molasses disaster. And afterwards, I had a listener write in and say that her mother, so my listener's mother, would be sent by her mother. So the listener's grandmother would send her mother with a tin cup to the molasses tank to just hold it up to the leaky rivet holes to get molasses whenever she needed it for baking. Um,
oh. I
and
mean, that's scary right there. I mean, you
yeah,
think
they
about.
tried patching it.
Oh,
They tried a few things, and then eventually the solution was just to paint the whole thing brown to hide how badly it leaked.
that's what they did. Oh,
That was the
God.
fix.
God, was it pooling on the ground as well? And it seems like that would attract like animals and
Oh,
things like that, you know?
I'm sure it was just a buffet for rats. I mean, I'm sure there were no fewer rats in Boston in 1919 than there
They
were
were very
are in
fat. Yeah.
2024.
Wow. Wow. And how many years did this thing hold?
So it was completed at the end of 1915. Again, it was they were racing the delivery that was coming in on New Year's Eve 1915, and it failed in mid-January 1919. So I guess just over 3 years.
Right. Now, it's so funny. You think about January when it happened and January when it's receiving a shipment. And it just seems like that's so cold. And you think of molasses as moving so slow. I mean, I can't even imagine what was pumping and how long it would take to like transfer from a ship cargo hold to the tank. I mean,
Well, that is an excellent point you raised there because there are a couple of factors at play that may have influenced the failure of the tank. First, it was January 15th was an unseasonably warm day. So the day before, it was in the single digits. I've heard 2 degrees, I've heard 5 degrees, but it was in the single digits Fahrenheit here in Boston. January 15th, it warmed up to the 50s. So it was a sudden warm snap.
mm-hmm.
And then they had on the 14th received a big shipment, and the tank was going to be filled more full than it ever had been before, which is great. But to make the molasses workable, as it's pumped out of a ship, there's a heating coil. I think it was electric heating coil to warm the molasses on the ship enough to be a little more not soluble, but a little less viscous, so to be a little easier to work with.
Yep.
So then they pumped this vast. I don't remember the exact number of gallons, but it's probably close to 1 million gallons of heated molasses into the tank. So there's a thought that maybe sort of the thermal expansion of the molasses that was already in the tank and sort of the churning as the cold and hot molasses mixed together. There's the different levels would churn together. That may have contributed to the collapse. I've heard theories about there being fermentation in the tank, but I think experts today would tell you that that probably wasn't a factor.
Well, they probably had some type of venting system for something like that to protect against something. I would imagine they would.
You would hope, but I wouldn't put anything past USIA at that point, given what the lawsuits later uncovered about the absolute negligence that they put into building that tank.
Yeah, amazing. So I can't even imagine, I forget what water weighs per gallon, but I can't imagine, molasses is really heavy,
Yeah,
to begin with. So there must be a tremendous amount of weight in that, especially when you get down toward the bottom. And it was just
yeah,
a time bomb. I
yeah,
mean, maybe all those things together, worked for that particular day, but it was going to happen sooner or later. I mean, with everything you've explained, especially about the steel tension and being so thin and everything, ridiculous. And so it was they riveted the thing together, and
they
it was
did.
actually leaking out the rivets. That alone would say that thing's going to burst. I mean, you would think.
Yeah,
you
and the
know?
company just brushed off complaints from neighbors, concerns from employees, as long as I mean, I I don't want to sound like one of the anarchists who would be blamed for the disaster later, but I mean, it was just as long as there were profits to be made, they were not hearing any arguments to the contrary.
So would you
Uh,
say that if, if you were to point a finger at one person the most, would it be the person that was in charge of the building, the treasurer? I
I mean,
mean,
either him or whoever decided he should be in charge of the project because I mean, it was just not somebody who was qualified to manage that construction. He just didn't understand the materials, the forces that were involved, to be able to make competent decisions.
and I would think that the company that sold him the steel and the workers and everyone would seem to know what they're doing, which is really bizarre that they would let that go. I mean, it's not the only
Yeah,
tank that was built at the time. I'm sure there were all kinds of tanks and different tanks, but
yeah.
so let's talk about the day that happened. Has you ever heard of any I mean, are the writings of direct, eyewitness accounts to what happened?
There are a few, and I've mostly gotten this from news accounts at the time. So the one sorry, I don't know if you could hear the car in the background.
Oh,
The
can't.
one good. The one actual eyewitness to the collapse of the tank that I've heard of is a Boston police patrolman named Frank McManus, who was on a foot patrol, and at 12:40, he, like everybody else in the North End, heard a tremendous sound. And others have described the sound as a machine gun followed by a freight train. And that's
That sounds like
interpreted
rivets popping.
the rivets
Pretty-
letting loose and then the
Yeah.
tank collapsing. But Frank
Mm,
McManus, Patrolman McManus, happened to. So today there are fire call boxes in a lot of major cities. Boston still has some fire call boxes. Mostly what we have is fire telegraphs. But at the time, there were both police and fire call boxes.
mm.
And he was already on a call box talking to the police station and just happened to be looking and facing the direction of the tank and witnessed the tank collapse. And so he immediately sounded the alarm, said, send every available ambulance, send every available officer, send everybody.
Mm.
Because what you then have, and you alluded to it before, is this wave of molasses. And this is where the idea that molasses is slow in January goes out the window because there's a wave that's cresting, 15, 20 feet tall, moving at 35 miles an hour. And I just looked up for a little bit of fun. We just had the Olympics a few weeks ago, and unfortunately, our American sprinter Noah Lyles didn't do so well at the Olympics because he apparently was trying to run with COVID, which isn't great.
Oh,
Uh, but he, I think last year, sometime recently, he set the 100-meter world record. So he is officially the fastest man alive, and he can
wow.
top out at about 27 miles an hour for 100 meters.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
you're talking racehorse speed, that this molasses is advancing through the neighborhood, cuts about a half-mile swath across the North End, sort of along Commercial Street on either side of Commercial Street. And again, I think the devastation is hard to imagine. I'm glad you have the photos to share with the audience, the video audience, because it first of all, any wood structures, any stick built houses or stores or buildings are just wiped off the face of the earth.
Well, if you look at this building that's right next to the tank right now, you're seeing this Victorian building
Mhm.
with this beautiful roof. And if you look at this picture, where did I just see that? I just saw that. Let me see if I can see it again. It showed it right.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
looks like
there it
the
is,
roof
right
line there,
there on the
doesn't it?
ground. It's right
Yeah.
there on the ground. The roof of it is just sitting there, and the whole structure is gone.
Yeah,
And
there was a bartender by the name of Martin Cloherty, who had worked late the night before. So the collapse happens at, like I say, at 12:40 in the afternoon, but being a bartender who was out all night working, he's in bed at the time, and he wakes up to his house being destroyed around him. And I have a quote that says, I was in bed on the third floor of my house when I heard a deep rumble. When I awoke, I was in several feet of molasses. And so he was in one of these
Wow.
wooden stick-built houses that was nearby. His house was swept into the elevated train tracks and basically just dashed itself to pieces against the elevated superstructure of the tracks. He survives by crawling back into bed. He pulls his sister up onto his bed with him, and the two of them basically use the bed as a boat
Oh my
to
God.
ride out the flood. But then his mother and one of his brothers, who were also home in the house at the time, they were both killed. Um,
Wow.
so
Yeah,
you
and the
can,
fire station next door, wasn't that that was, I think there was a survivor or two in that, but that was those
yeah,
guys were wiped out.
yeah, there was only one firefighter killed. So Firehouse 31 was literally right next door to the molasses tank. So you'd expect the firefighters, the North End Fire Station, to be the first responders to this terrible disaster, but the firehouse is knocked off its foundation badly enough that they're trapped inside, treading water essentially in the molasses for hours until volunteers, neighborhood folks, can basically cut through enough of the fire station to get them out. And in the time that takes, one of the firefighters, I don't remember his name unfortunately, but one of the firefighters just was exhausted and he couldn't swim anymore and he just slipped below the surface and drowned.
Wow. I can't imagine, well, I can't imagine a drowning anyway, but in
And
molasses.
molasses sounds just terrible. The first,
Yeah.
because the firefighters are trapped in their own firehouse, the first responders were cadets from the Mass Maritime Academy who were on a training ship that was moored nearby, called the Nantucket. And about 115 or 120 cadets came in, and they were the first to start sorting through the just terrible destruction that's left behind, because the the molasses, once the wave slows down, it's not moving at 35 miles an hour and starts to slow down and cool. It
Mm.
pools in many places in lakes of molasses that are waist deep around the neighborhood. And in the Boston Post the next day, they described, you'd go in, you have just everybody is turning out to try to help in any way they can. So you have parents, neighbors, teachers, whoever, trying to find their loved ones in this mess. And they say you'd see a form thrashing in the sticky black pool, and you wouldn't know whether it was a horse or a man until you went and pulled them out. And hopefully you got there in time. But in
Yeah.
a lot of cases, they didn't. And again, I think the final death toll was about 21, and
Right.
at
Yeah.
least 150 people injured. And then untold, you think about 1919, my grandparents were alive at the time, and horses and mules were still very common
Oh yeah.
in all kinds of industries and transportation. So they're just untold animals that were drowned in this flood as well.
Not to mention the rats.
Yes. Yeah, we don't
They're
cry.
feeding
I
right
shed no
there.
tears for the rats.
But yeah, and you think about how what a mess this I mean, I can't imagine, I mean, everything is about this is a disaster, but then can you imagine the cleanup afterwards and what that how could you clean up something like this? I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
years and years of rain is helpful, but
right.
seasons and
Yeah, I
but
mean, the rescue attempts go on for, I think, a couple of days, basically, where they're, getting people out of the wreckage still alive for a while, and then the recovery
Mhm.
efforts go on for weeks and weeks. I think the
Yeah.
the last body was found in the harbor in April. So that they finally, the human toll is dealt with, and then, like you say, you have 2.3 million gallons of molasses coating everything in this neighborhood. So they end up pumping seawater, millions and millions of gallons of seawater through the streets of the North End to try and flush the
Ah.
molasses away. They felt that
Yep.
it worked a little
Mhm.
better than fresh water, and it's right there, right on the waterfront. So why not?
Mm.
And then the because of this, then the harbor turned brown for months afterwards, because
Oh,
there was
yeah.
no sense, there's no Deer Island filtration or anything at the time. They're just uh, flushing it all straight into the harbor. So yeah, I think it was probably a stinking mess of a harbor for a few months afterwards.
I would say. And do you think that a lot of I'm picturing this, I don't know if there was a certain direction the molasses went in, or if it just burst at the bottom and went everywhere. But did a lot of it go into the harbor directly? Do you know?
I think it must have, just from the
Mm.
location of the tank. So again, if you think about the north end, if any of your listeners are in Boston, it's the site of Langone Park today. So there's some ball fields and some bocce courts, and then it's directly abutting the harbor. So at least some of it must have gone straight into the harbor if it sort of, burst in all directions the way you'd expect it to.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but then, on the land side, like I say, it's just swept away any wood building, uh, just smashed to toothpicks. It was so powerful. Some of the photos you showed, the elevated tracks, which are these enormous steel girders and steel
Right.
spans, or iron girders and spans between them. They were twisted in some cases. They had to be extensively repaired, and then fragments of the tank itself. These big twisted steel sheets that used to be a molasses tank were then driven throughout the town and sort of wrapped around train cars and uh, you know trucks and cars. Automobiles are buried in the goo. So yeah, the cleanup effort had to be just incredible, and that's where one of the persistent legends, I guess, of the molasses flood comes from. People say, I will say, disreputable travel sites say that
Uh,
even today on a hot summer's day, you can smell molasses throughout the streets of the North End. And that's just not true. If you walk in the streets of the North End on a hot summer day, you're going to smell rotten dumpster, not molasses. But I
yeah.
do think there was some truth. I think for some time afterwards,
Yeah.
you would smell molasses because no matter how much seawater you pump through the streets, people were, everything you touched afterwards, you would transfer molasses to it, right? So if you were helping with the cleanup and you got on the trolley to go home, you're going to track molasses into the trolley and then you're going to track it into your house. And so I do think that there was some truth to the legend that for some time afterwards, Boston smelled like molasses, but no more.
Do you think there was ever? I mean, do you think there was any historical landmarks like homes that were lost in that? Are you aware of any of them?
I don't really think so. And of
Mhm.
course, everything's historic to somebody, and
Yeah.
people's homes are important to them, and those were destroyed, and their businesses were destroyed. The fire station, a police station, was badly damaged. But it was located in the uh, the more industrial part of the North End. So a lot of the oldest development would have been sort of on the other side of that thumb of the mitten I was talking about. The North End was the first part of the Shawmut Peninsula to have English homes on it when the Puritans moved from Charlestown across the Charles River to get better water in the North End. But they would mostly settle more on the Mill Pond side and the harbor side, not so much on the Charles River side. So a lot of the oldest parts of the North End were sort of a little further away, a few blocks away. And luckily, most of that older development was uphill.
I see. Yep. I was just trying to pull up a map of Boston so I could show the. I can't seem to get it to download, but anyway, the aftermath of this whole thing is just as crazy. I mean, there was someone, of course, the company, they weren't want to run for their lives and, make sure they don't go, you know, belly up. So they're immediately try to come up with a story that it was an anarchist
Yeah,
that
and
set a
you can
bomb.
see that on the front page you brought up. You can see the language of an explosion because that's what it seemed like to everybody who witnessed it. It seemed like an explosion, and the U.S. industrial alcohol ran with that.
Yeah.
Um, there was this idea that it had been anarchists who dynamited the tank, and yes, well, first of all, it's a very convenient scapegoat, but
Yeah.
there was some reason to think that could have been the case, although there was no direct evidence to prove that it was the case. That anarchy was it was a growing and for a lot of people very attractive political movement in the early part of the 20th century, especially coming from different parts of Europe that were still. I think about Eastern Europe, which was still very close to a feudal state under sort of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serfdom was basically still in place, although legally abolished in most places. It was still practiced practically in a lot of places. So this idea of, absolutely egalitarian society without nobility, without, sort of the structures of the state, I can see as a Bulgarian serf why that was attractive. So
Mhm.
it starts, right around the turn of the 20th century, spreads across Europe, spreads to the US through migration. And there is a lot of, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, there's a lot of political violence in the US
Yeah,
committed by,
McKinley
yeah,
gets
the
shot. Yeah.
1901 McKinley, 1914, an assassination attempt on John Rockefeller in New York.
Mhm.
In 1916, right in the North End, there were a couple of incidents. There was uh, a protest or a riot, depending on which source you read, in North Square, right in front of Paul Revere's house, where a policeman was stabbed. And then also in 1916, a police station in the North End was dynamited, but
Oh,
it was
yes.
done off hours. So a lot of property damage, but nobody was actually injured.
Right.
And then
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
during World War One, anarchists were highly opposed to the U.S. entry into World War One. So even some of, not in the Boston area, but some of the other facilities of U.S. industrial alcohol were dynamited, I think, in the New York area. So there was some reason to think it could have been an anarchist attack. There was, I mean, I could see why somebody had that first instinct, that first reaction, but it turned out to not hold water. But
Yeah. There was so the
luckily,
there was they hired their own investigator
yeah,
that was trying to make it appear that way.
yeah.
And but I think didn't the city of Boston also have their own investigators? And they saw no signs of any explosion right off the bat, right? Pretty quickly.
Well, a lot of the fact finding was done as part of this enormous civil lawsuit. So, in the wake of the collapse, um, a lot of individual victims and victims' families filed lawsuits, and then the largest single plaintiff was Boston Elevated Railway Company, because
Mm.
their tracks and stuff was so badly impacted by the molasses flood. Um, so I think there was something in the neighborhood of about 120 civil suits filed, and they were consolidated then into one of the first early, really big class actions. And so it was brought before the Mass Superior Court, and the Superior Court appointed a retired military officer, a retired colonel named Hugh Ogden, to be to lead the hearings, basically to act as the judge in this giant civil case it dragged out for over 5 years. The final judgment
Jeez.
wasn't until I think early 1925. There were,
Wow.
thousands of exhibits introduced into evidence. Hundreds or maybe 1,000 witnesses gave testimony. You had survivors testifying, structural engineers testifying. You had explosive experts. You had company employees, and in the end, again, thanks in part to the independent investigators hired by the plaintiffs' lawyers, it was chalked up to 100% negligence. There was incorrect materials, incorrect construction, didn't uphold design standards for tanks of that type. Um,
Hmm.
just it was a bad job, badly done.
And so, did anyone ever announce what I know they settled out of court eventually, but did anyone ever understand what the total amount of that settlement was?
So the figure I've seen is $628,000, which I've learned in my 8 years or so of podcasting that converting historical currency to modern is a little bit of a fool's errand. My best back of the envelope calculation is about $8 or $10 million, but it's so hard to draw parallels.
And that
Um,
was split between how many people, do you know? Because there were a lot of victims other than the ones of the families that died.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the breakdown would have been between individual victims and their families and sort of the larger, like again, Boston Elevated Railway Company.
Mm.
I think there were, like I said, I think there were about 120 parties to that lawsuit. So somehow it would have
Mm.
been divided up between them. And then, of course, legal fees. Lawyers always take a
Oh
cut.
yeah, that's right. That's right. I wonder if it was a third back then. So I pulled up the old map, an old map. This is an
Yeah.
1830s map,
Yeah.
and so let's see, where am I looking at? There's so many things that could look like a mitten.
Yeah,
Uh,
so this is after a little bit of the 19th century land making. So the mitten shape is a little less pronounced here, largely because
okay.
there was a mill pond between the north end and the west end that was filled in right at the turn of the 19th century
Oh,
for
I got it.
development. But if
Yeah,
we look here, the north end is sort of the upper right quadrant of that peninsula that sticks
in
up
the
sort of
red,
toward.
it's
So it's
outlined
gonna
in red. Yeah.
so here, let me look a little closer. Let me look at my other monitor.
Oh,
So the part of the north end is outlined in blue, and
oh, okay, got it. Yep.
I think it's mostly in blue there, from what I
I
can
see it.
see.
I see it now. Yep.
And then the tank would have been located uh, sort of at the uppermost point of that part of the peninsula, the right where the commercial street takes a hard southerly turn as it comes around the shoreline. It would have been about where the tank was.
I see. Yep. So that's really, I mean, this story is just unbelievable, and all the people that affected, and like you said, think of all the horses and other animals that were killed. So many,
Yeah,
I'm sure, probably in the hundreds. Um,
yeah.
but so now we're kind of through that, and I do appreciate that a lot. But I want to ask you a couple of other questions. And
Yeah, absolutely.
you mentioned kind of weird things, that kind of fascinates me a little bit. So what are some of your favorite stories that you have covered in Boston? Just a handful of them, if we could hear some.
So, okay, let me give you a couple of weird stories that I'm fond of. Let's see. Um, well, one story that my episode about this was years ago now, and it didn't I didn't think as much about it at the time, but as the time has gone on, it's become one of my favorite stories that I've told on the podcast. Is about the first ever captive whale in the world, which was
Hmm.
exhibited on Washington Street in Boston's downtown crossing in 1860, which is way earlier than you would think something like that was possible. Far, far before our modern New England aquarium was a
Oh
glimmer in
yeah.
anybody's eye.
Yeah.
Um, there was uh, an inventor by the name of James Ambrose Cutting. He got fairly wealthy from inventing a new photographic process, the ambrotype. He named it
Oh
after
yeah.
himself, of course. Um, and he was fascinated with aquariums. So it was at the time, some of the very earliest aquariums in the world were developed in London. So he got one of the first books about aquariums. He had a couple of home aquariums. He said, "Let's make a business out of this." So he starts this aquarium. It's small tanks, a lot of like turtles and fish and things like that. And he gets the idea of what can really get people in the door is a whale. And so he ends up partnering with a man that I think his name was Frank Butler. His last name's definitely Butler, and P.T. Barnum, the Greatest
Mm.
Showman.
Hmm.
So Butler brings the aquarium know-how. Uh, Cutting brings the enthusiasm, and then P.T. Barnum brings a lot of cash, and they end up hiring a whaler in Canada. So the southernmost range of the beluga whale, so the white whale, is along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. So their summer feeding grounds. They come into the mouth of the St. Lawrence and they feed on fish runs in the summertime. So they build these giant fish weirs. And at the time, they were building these, of course, to kill the belugas, to harvest the whale oil, the fat, the
Mm.
render into whale oil. That's a big commercial product. And Cutting says to one of these whalers, "Hey, keep one alive for me."
Hmm.
And it actually works, is the amazing thing. They build this giant crate they can put a 20-foot long whale into, ship it by rail down through Portland down to Boston, basically tip this crate up on its side into this. I think the tank was 20 or 30 feet 30 feet in diameter. So the whale barely has room to turn around.
God.
And then you can pay your 20 cents and go see a captive whale. And the show is the handlers basically would chase the whale into a corner of the tank, put a harness on it, And
Oh,
then the whale would pull this little novelty boat in the shape of a nautilus shell with a woman standing in it around and around and around this little tank while people, clapped and cheered, had a
oh
great
my
time.
God.
Um,
Geez, that
yeah,
is a bizarre one.
yeah, that's one of my favorites. I like some of the weirdo history where, because of the location of slaughterhouses in Boston. It's now a neighborhood of Boston called Brighton. At the time, it was an independent town. It's like a little Wild West. If you dig into the history, there were cattle drives overland from Vermont, from upstate New York, from New Hampshire, where people would drive cattle to market in Boston. So you'd have drovers, cowboys, essentially, gambling at the Porterhouse Hotel in Brighton and going to the cattle fairs. Um,
Wow.
and then, getting swindled out of their cash and things like that, all those good stories. And then they would also have turkey drives at Thanksgiving time. So especially from Vermont, they would drive these huge flocks of turkeys. They say turkeys were docile, so you could have just 2 or 3 people driving a herd of thousands of turkeys overland, um, roosting in people's trees. You have these, people complaining about all these turkeys coming and trying to roost in their barns overnight during the turkey drives, and like collapsing the roof from the weight of hundreds of turkeys all on the shed at the same time. But they would drive
Oh,
turkeys overland to the markets in Boston and in Brighton at the time. This continued,
God.
obviously eventually a railroad comes, they move them by rail car and things like that. So but into the 1950s, there was massive slaughterhouses in Brighton, to the point where the Brighton police station used to keep special ammo on hand for breakaway steers that would rampage through the streets. In the 40s or 50s, there was a report of a steer goring several construction workers before it could be shot by the police and put
Wow.
out of its misery. But yeah, I love the idea of the Wild West in
Yeah.
Brighton, which is now, basically known as like a college neighborhood, like a college student neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I was working in an office for a while in Woburn, and I went out and saw this. It was all grown up along this. I thought it was a stream, and then I look and it was granite lined, and it's a canal
Yeah,
that
yeah, the
they used to
Middlesex
transport.
Canal.
Yeah, the Middlesex Canal. That's exactly what it was. And you think of it's such rich history. That was
Yeah,
lumber. I believe they floated lumber.
all
Into
kinds of products, all
all kinds of things. Yeah.
lumber, a lot of agricultural goods from, if you think about it's joining the Merrimack to
Right.
Boston. So,
Yeah.
all the products of New Hampshire, a lot of crops, a lot of lumber, livestock. It was a huge investment, a huge infrastructure upgrade, and unfortunately, trains were invented like the next day. So a lot of
Yeah.
the investors basically lost their shirts in that, and a lot of the course of the Middlesex Canal got converted into a railroad right away. But there are these great reminiscences. Uh, Among other things, it was a huge linear skating rink in the wintertime. So
Oh.
you could skate from like Woburn to Billerica and back
Oh my God.
along
Wow,
the
isn't that
Middlesex Canal
something?
in the winter. And there were, in the sort of the mid 19th century, I saw several published reminiscences of people who could remember going skating on the Middlesex Canal as just a wee lad. So
Wow.
I love infrastructure history like that, between building Boston's first sanitary sewers to constructing the water supplies for Boston's always struggled to bring enough fresh water for the number of people who lived here. So you had wells and springs give way to, so these wooden pipes from Jamaica Pond into downtown Boston, which, if you go to the Boston Archaeology Lab, you can still see some of those wooden pipes on display, or not. If you talk to the folks, they're not really on display, but you might be able to talk your way into the back room to see them there. To then the Costituate Aqueduct, with this huge engineering marvel, and then today's, of course, the Quabbin, which provides us the best drinking water in America, I'm told.
Well, you think of water and populations, all over the country, and the struggles, and you think of Mulholland out in California that,
Yeah.
came up with a 200-mile aqueduct out there, because of Los Angeles kept growing. That's always the problem, is
Mhm.
fresh water, and to get fresh water to a place like that. And Arizona's in trouble. They have that aquifer there. It's in trouble. Yet they
Yeah.
keep growing. And that's what we do.
Yeah,
No,
it's
we
true.
always, yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it a lot. And so it's Hub History, and
Yep.
that's a podcast you can get anywhere you listen to podcasts, and that's basically Boston history and entertaining as well. So
Yeah, I like to say we go far beyond the Freedom Trail. So we tell some of the stories you would have learned in your middle school history classes, but we try and go way beyond that too, to tell stories that are unexpected or about people who would otherwise be forgotten. So hubhistory.com. It's
yeah.
any place you get your podcasts. And we try and tell all the stories of Boston. Told over 300 so far, and we're still going.
Wow, that's great. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
No, I appreciate it.
All right. Okay. We'll see you next time.